I've been playing a lot of Destiny 2 lately, probably too much, but I can't help myself. There's always something to do, some milestone that's about to unlock, or some event that's ready to go just around the corner. It's the definition of a compulsive experience, and it reminds me of this great Diablo 2 retrospective from Erik. On a smaller scale, Schaefer writes, "We try to make every single action fun. Moving around inventory items produces pleasing sounds, monsters die in spectacular fashion like piñatas. We strove for overkill in this sense, in that players are constantly on the verge of something great, only a few mouse clicks away from a dozen interesting things." The core experience of Destiny 2, the very microscopic minute-to-minute stuff, serves as a better torchbearer of that design philosophy than Path of Exile or even Diablo 3. But more than that, Destiny 2, just like Titanfall 2 before it, is a simple sequel that makes good on many of the promises made by its predecessor. More of a refinement than a brand new entry. I didn't play the first Destiny at launch, but I read about its issues and supposedly troubled development on the internet. When I finally did get around to playing it around the time Taken King came out in 2015, the one thing that stuck out and the one thing I will never forget about that game was its story, and maybe even more importantly, the way it was told. At first glance, Destiny doesn't really seem to have any story at all, just a handful of cutscenes haphazardly cobbled together that never really make any sense. There's no beginning, middle, or end, or really even any villain to speak of. It's just hours of bland, monotonous dribble. And anytime you think you have the plot cornered, like the characters are going to have to finally start explaining things, you get something like this.
I don't even have time to explain why I don't have time to explain. I will.
It's absolutely maddening. NPCs only offer passing salutations that do nothing for the plot. Any sort of storytelling through level design is a lost cause. There are barely any characters, let alone motivations for those characters, and most of the substantial cutscenes spend more time setting up future DLC and expansions than dealing with whatever the hell the base game's campaign was actually about. The whole thing gives off this Frankenstein vibe, like whatever was on the production line when this thing wrapped was scooped up and taped together, and now we have stuff like this.
What happened to it? I could tell you of the great battle centuries ago. How the Traveler was crippled. I could tell you of the power of the darkness, its ancient enemy. There are many tales told throughout the city to frighten children. Lately, those tales have stopped. Now, the children are frightened anyway.
It's missing a lot. Mounting evidence of cut content surfaced in the months after release, some outlets reporting that the head honchos decided to make sweeping changes to the game both narratively and structurally just a year before launch, all so that the finished product would be less linear and more open world. Players soon found that the majority of the game's lore, like 90% of it, could be found in the Grimoire cards collected throughout the game. And the world building found on the Grimoire cards is actually kind of excellent, or it's at least very robust. Some cards were only a few sentences long, but others could easily pass as short stories. Characters and locations from the game are filled out here more than anywhere else. You learn about the Ahamkara, a dragon-like race that the Guardians hunted to extinction. You flip through the Book of Sorrows, a compendium of the Hive's history penned by Oryx himself and stretching back long before the dawn of man. You read a first-hand account of the Ares 1 expedition and the moments just before humanity first laid its eyes on the Traveler. And as I grew more accustomed to reading through the Grimoire, I couldn't help but be reminded of Dark Souls and the way it told its story, mostly through item descriptions and opaque NPC dialogue.
There is an old saying in my family, "Thou who art undead art chosen, and thine exodus from the undead asylum maketh pilgrimage to the land of ancient lords."
In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if Destiny's senior design team was at least in part influenced by Dark Souls storytelling when they were asked to overhaul the game a year before launch. It's really not that far of a stretch, considering Dark Souls was already cited as having a design influence on Destiny during its development back in 2013. Still, Dark Souls went on to be celebrated, and Destiny is criticized to this day. I think it'd be easy to brush this off and give the easy answer, which I've avoided mentioning so far, but here it is. Those Grimoire cards, the sole source of world building in Destiny, they're not actually in the game. You unlock them as little mini achievements, and then you need to log into Bungie.net or the Destiny Companion app to actually read them. But just because this is the easy answer doesn't mean it's wrong. It's hard to care about a game's world when the reasons to care about it aren't actually in the game. Looking back, the Grimoire cards sometimes seem more like a happy accident than any conscious or deliberate design decision, as if Destiny's original story was meant to be told through these cinematics, and the cards were meant as either a band-aid or as a supplement to a larger story that was never told. Either way, the game was never confident enough with the Grimoire cards or the organic storytelling that Dark Souls excelled at, which has honestly always been my biggest disappointment with the game. Dark Souls levels and environments interact with its lore in a way that Destiny never does. Take Kirk, Knight of Thorns, for example. We learn about Kirk first through item descriptions, but his character is actually developed by the locations where he invades us and where we eventually find his body after we defeat him. It turns out that Kirk betrayed his covenant to Darkstalker Kaith in order to serve the Fair Lady, but that's never explicitly told in item descriptions or NPC dialogue. It's told through level design and enemy placement. And that sort of thing is what elevates Dark Souls' storytelling, what makes it more than a few words that you get to read on loading screens and item descriptions. The text in Dark Souls paints its world as this lost civilization stuck in endless cycles of darkness and rebirth, one that's currently on the brink of madness as the curse of the undead spreads throughout the land, and when you look around, you see that. Destiny's world is also one on the brink. After the Great Collapse, humanity has retreated from the solar system all the way to the last city on Earth, one last refuge watched over by the Traveler. And you see the remains of civilization at the Cosmodrome, on the Moon, and on Mars, but it never connects thematically with what we read on the cards. You never really see the damage. Life in the city seems fine, the streets are clean and packed with people, no one seems to be wanting, which is just so at odds with the history of the world as described by Bungie.net. In another Grimoire card, Cade 6 tells the story of a connection with a fallen warrior on the battlefield, depicting them as more than just the mindless drones you farm for weekly quests. Other cards speculate on the origin of the Exos, and one card that I'll never forget suggests that the Traveler is not what it seems, that it very well might be a force of darkness, and not the bringer of life we assumed it was. There's all this pseudo-philosophical angst that just isn't present anywhere else in the game. So when Destiny 2 was finally announced, I was cautiously excited that they would expand on the Grimoire cards. After all, Destiny's world and lore, once everyone read up on it, was pretty well received. In the back of my mind, I was hoping they'd grow more confident in that kind of storytelling, keep some cutscenes maybe, but tell the story through NPCs, level design, and Grimoire cards. Let us figure it out, and do away with any sort of traditional narrative space, since Destiny was never about that to begin with. That thought, though, in retrospect, seems misguided. Destiny 2 was never going to be that game, and the fact that Destiny ever came close to being that game in the first place was a fluke. Something unpredictable that only occurred because of events that took place a year before the game's launch. And even if it was done on purpose, I get the impression that Destiny 2's design team wanted to do anything they could to get away from the first game's story and the way it was told. They're not mentioning the darkness anymore, and the Exo Stranger story, at least as far as Luke Smith is concerned, is finished. Dunzo. There are no new classes in Destiny 2, no new enemies or playable races. The only new feature is its story, and I think that's saying a lot. Destiny 2 has a bad guy that's a bad guy. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and every mission starts and concludes with a nice little cutscene that actually makes sense. Destiny 2's story is a consequence of the franchise's history, all the way from its botched development and bungled launch through its lifespan to now. Bungie, in its hurry to address every single popular critique with the first game's campaign, built a bland blockbuster video game narrative that's scared to offend anyone and designed to appeal to the largest audience possible. That means set piece after set piece, cliched villains and heroes, and a sort of forced personality-starved brevity between its cast of celebrity-voiced characters.
Ikora, if you tell me this is a practical joke, well, it kills me to say it, but I would be really impressed.
The game sometimes feels at odds with itself. This whole light and darkness thing only ever worked when you didn't think too hard about it. But when you have supervillain Dominus Gall front and center saying things like he's going to extract the light from the Traveler, or prove himself worthy, or whatever, it all seems a bit nonsensical.
Tell me again, Speaker, what makes your guardians worthy of the light?
The light lives in all places.
Then there is no reason I should not reach inside, tear at the light for myself. I will not take the light by force. To do so would be to admit failure. I am Gaul, and I will take the light.
And all of that is not to say that Destiny 2's story is bad. In fact, by first-person shooter standards, it's actually quite good. But I think I'd rather see interesting concepts done poorly than the same storytelling in every other first-person shooter. So what happened to the Grimoire cards? Well, they're gone. Instead, lore is handed out via scannable items in the environment, in adventures, idle NPC chatter, and item descriptions. I've actually only found around 4 scannable items so far after 50 or so hours of playing. Adventures do an alright job of hinting at future developments, and the idle NPC chatter sometimes does a better job of building characters than the story missions. Meanwhile, item descriptions end up being watered down versions of the first game's Grimoire cards, and all that is fine, but none of it ever approaches the scope of what we got with the first game. Someone coming into Destiny 1 might not know there's a larger world at play because they haven't read the Grimoire. Someone coming into Destiny 2 might not know there's a larger world at play because that information and context doesn't exist anymore. Part of what made the Grimoire cards so excellent in the first place was because of community-created content on channels like My Name is Bife and Destiny Guides. Go check them out if you haven't. It's a huge accomplishment that this franchise has created that kind of community, but I don't think that was something Bungie ever planned for. That whole community was born out of a confluence of events, not out of any deliberate design decision on Bungie's end. And honestly, I suspect that the vast majority of players never read a Grimoire card, and with the mostly positive reviews of Destiny 2's narrative, I don't think they'll be missed. Still, I wish Bungie had embraced them more in the sequel, because the Grimoire cards, unlike the campaign in either game, offered me a world I wanted to explore. It's just a shame that that world never really existed, and it probably never will. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Sorry it's been a long break since the last video. I'm putting together an analysis on Final Fantasy XIV that's shaping up to be the biggest project I've done so far. Hopefully it'll be ready soon, but if it isn't, I'll try to put together another short video like this one to fill in the gap. If you loved the video, the best way to support the channel is to check out the Patreon link below. Thanks so much, guys. Stay tuned. There's more to come.